In this video I'm playing in the round 2 of 2022 Summer 1v1 Risk Elo tournament with the 28th ladder opponent Hobson Hughes 3, with myself currently being in the 25th position. We will be playing 4 games on Supermax Prison World Domination and 4 games on King Dynasty Zombie Apocalypse. Each of us has to go first and second the same amount of times on both of the maps. And as you can see in the first game I set up my troops in the way to go for 2 continents, and my opponent set his troops in the way to go or counter 1 continent along with making a 4 troop split in one of the dead ends. And in my turn I captured both of these continents. My opponent then broke through one of them successfully with a 56% blitz roll, losing 4 troops fewer than me, and then he captured his main continent. So then I recaptured my second continent losing 3 troops fewer, and then with the fortification choice I strengthened my other continent, which my opponent broke into successfully with a 75% blitz roll. And then I recaptured it again. And then he invaded it again. I recaptured it for another time, but I realized that it doesn't lead me to anything good, and I could even lose with I end up with not a really good amount of troops for the second continent guard. So I knew that I had to capture that continent so to force my opponent to unleash his main continent to my biggest army with him needing to capture that territory, and I delayed it too long, but I thought at the very least I will do that once I trade in a set at 4 cards. But surprise surprise, I didn't have a set at 4 cards. My opponent got to trade in a set before me, and I think his best chance to win would have been to set up his new troops in the way to manual roll both of my continent armies which weren't accessible to his main army. Otherwise I'm not really sure what would have given him a potential chance to make a comeback. Because as you can see I've got to invade him into both of his continents easily, and with that I scored my first point in the series. This is the second game and I think my opponent highly increased my chances to win by selecting even 4 border territories in the center continent, while leaving me only 2. And in that game in my first turn I captured 2 continents, while very luckily for me my opponent selected to go for the continents which I had the access to with my biggest army. These ones would have been the ones which I wouldn't have the access to due to me having these 2 territories. But the way my opponent set his troops to, led me of immediately having the access to immediately invade my opponent into all of his continents. But right here my opponent made a very smart move to use 1 die manual roll so to only leave 1 troop behind instead of 3, and with that he was actually very close to invading me into my second continent too. But he didn't, and with that the game was clearly mine. I get 1 more point and the result becomes 2-0. In the third Supermax game I put my troops in the way to counter those 2 continents, and actually I predicted my opponent right. He set up his troops in the way to go for these 2 exact continents. My opponent lost the 75% 13 versus 11 blitz roll, and that's what I needed. I invaded my opponent into both of his continents, taking over one of them, and next to that capturing another continent too. My opponent only successfully invaded one of them, and with that the game was won for me. I just capitalized on my huge territorial advantage and with that ended up holding both of my continents. The result after 3 games becomes 4-0 with me increasing my lead. In the fourth Supermax game I set up my troops in the way to potentially counter all of 3 from my opponent suitable to go for continents, so just adding more troops on 2 of the armies while the third one leaving with fewer troops. And at the end I had the 75% chance 13 versus 11, and the 72% chance 8 versus 6 blitz rolls. The latter one went unsuccessfully for me, and with that I lost chances to win. Basically, after 4 games the result becomes 4-1 with me still being in a strong lead. This is the 5th game, or the first game on King Dynasty with Zombie Apocalypse in which our setup looked like that. My opponent didn't predict my stack, but he had a 6 troops army next to it, and then adding newly gotten troops on it he started to manual roll my army at the end, getting the attacker's advantage of 4 troops. And with his biggest army he invaded me into my continent. And then since my opponent's biggest army was blocked from that continent, I decided to capture it intending to properly guard it. But then the zombies actually unleashed his biggest army next to my continent, and my opponent got a good attacker's advantage when crushing these armies of threes, so I think I shouldn't have really gone for it and instead of it rather keeping my troops in a big army. But luckily I've still got very lucky manual rolls to break through his continent. But then I couldn't really do much and he ended up holding that continent until I traded in a set at 4 cards. But then the same thing and I was just forced to hide myself, hoping that my opponent makes some misplay. But very soon my opponent came for my troops, but very luckily for me he failed taking me out. I didn't have a set, and capturing a territory I saw that the 9 troops army will be in the path to take over both of my territories, so I just tried capturing one more territory and hoped that my opponent potentially is left with no troops as well and that the zombies will wipe him out first, but the zombies wiped me out first, and with that the result becomes 4-2. In the 6th game I predicted my opponent's stack, but unfortunately I didn't get any attacker's advantage, losing the same amount of troops as my opponent. Though I was still in a territorial advantage with the zombies not really capturing many territories, so I decided to capitalize on that. And it really worked well. In the second turn, zombies just got +1s on their territories, and weren't able to capture that much stuff in that turn either. But then after the third turn they got +2 troops on each of their territories, so that was really a mistake for me to continue capitalizing on capturing the territories in the third round. Then my opponent traded in a set at 3 cards and crushed my army right here, luckily for me not really being favored with the attacker's advantage. I didn't have a set at 4 cards, so I just had to wait, being left with just a few troops. And then at 5 cards that was finally the time for me to trade in a set, and looking to the cards I saw that my opponent is hiding in the territory of Outer Mongolia, since that card didn't have +2 troops sign on it. So I just immediately went for my opponent and luckily took him out. The result after 6 games becomes 5-2 with me increasing my lead. In the 7th game I decided to put my army to that territory, so I would either predict my opponent's stack, or would be able to hold that continent without my opponent having the access to me either, assuming the zombie infect doesn't mess up the plans for me. And my opponent very luckily for me added his army to this territory, which with having that territory, he was completely blocked, and luckily the zombies didn't unleash him either. So wiping the zombies out I took over all of those territories. For some reason I thought that I'm connected to the bottom row of my opponent's territories too, so this is why I didn't add any troops for them, and with that didn't end up capturing them. My opponent broke through 2 of my continents, but I still held the other 3, and luckily my opponent forgot to fortify his army out from the blocked place. So then I just finished capturing all of those territories, guarding the whole world with only 2 borders to guard. But then unluckily zombies took over one of my territories and started attacking me like crazy. The good thing is that I still at least received the continental troop bonus for 2 of my continents, so then I started manual rolling my opponent with my smaller army, and then luckily finished taking him out with my bigger one. The result after 7 games becomes 6-2 with me increasing my lead. In the 8th game my opponent ended up predicting my stack, and with attacking it he got a super good attacker's advantage of losing even 12 troops fewer than me. So with that the game was lost for me basically and instantly. So unless the zombies would have infected my opponent's biggest stack or something like that. But that didn't happen. And with that the final score becomes 6-3 with me still winning the series. Here's the end of the second round, and from the 25th place I ranked up to the 17th, and my opponent from the 28th place ranked down to the 30th place. Now if you're interested in checking out the full tournament series, then click on the playlist at the top right, and if you're interested in watching more 1v1 competitions in general, then click on the playlist at the bottom right.